Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to the latest Radio Centre Ireland webinar. It's actually the last webinar of 2025, but I think it's a really important webinar, this particular topic that we're looking at today, which is the findings from the Irish audio report. So I'm delighted that Karen Hall from Ipsos B&A is here to go through the details of the report with you all. As I'm sure you're very familiar with the JNLR, and it releases data 4 times a year on listening essentially to radio and radio stations. But as part of that process, 1/4 every year, we ask respondents extra questions about overall audio listening. So it runs for a complete quarter, so it's a very large sample of almost 3,100 people. And what we're looking at here is the overall relationship with audio, which I think is really, really important. And I think really a key metric, and Karen will go through this, is share of time spent listening across all types of audio, be it podcasts, streaming, your own music like vinyl or downloads, and of course, radio. And the report also goes through lots of other things like how people listen, what device, for example, where people listen, are they at home, are they in the car? And lots of other really interesting statistics that look at the entire audio market in Ireland. There is a Q&A button on screen, so please type in any questions that you may have. And at the end of the session, I'll read those questions out to Karen, and we'll go through those questions right at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to go through the findings of the 2025 Irish Audio Report. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Kieran. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As Kieran mentioned, this report is based on the special module we include along with the core JNLR interview. And the questionnaire in that module aimed to identify behaviour in the broader audio space, for live radio, for music streaming, for podcasting, and so on. So today we're going to look at a couple of key areas. We're going to look a little bit at technology, what people own and the subscriptions they might have, for example. We'll then look at the audio market, the reach numbers, the share numbers, and so on, and the trends that we see there. And then we're going to look at the zone in specifically on the daily picture, again, reach and share, and so on. We look at the environment in which people are listening to audio, and then we'll finish up with a little bit of a summary. So first of all, in the area of the technology, Irish audiences are highly connected, as we probably all know. So we can see here with this initial question that we ask them, the high levels of people who have access to broadband, for example, at 91%. 91% own a smartphone. 44% own a voice-activated tech or smart speaker, and 56% own Bluetooth wireless headphones. Now, this technology tends to be held to a greater extent among the younger audiences. Higher proportions of them would own the tech. If we look specifically at the smart speaker figure, we can see that there's been significant growth of smart speakers since 2019, when we began to measure this question. But growth has been reasonably static over the past few years. So if you look at that trend, you can see in 2019, 13% said they owned a smart speaker. It grew to 30%, and then grew quite rapidly, 40%, 45%. But over the last 3 years, it's been hovering at that 45, 44, and it's now currently at 44%. Again, for smart speakers, ownership is higher among the younger groups. But while adoption is lower among the older 45 pluses, in recent years, we have seen some growth among those older groups as well. We moved on and we asked people what types of, we asked them in relation to specific subscriptions, whether they had a paid subscription to audio streaming, such as Spotify Premium, for example, whether they had a paid subscription to YouTube Premium, or whether they had a paid subscription to any podcast at all. And we can see, if we look to the left of the chart, we can first look at the section on the audio streaming. This is the one, I suppose, that's driving the subscription space overall. We can see that 34% of people have a subscription to an audio streaming service. As I said, higher among the younger groups, 49% among those aged 15 to 24, and 46% among those 25 to 44. And then it drops to 21% among the older 45s. If we move across then and look at the YouTube Premium, much lower subscription levels to YouTube Premium, 11% overall. Higher again among the 15-24s at 14%, little higher again among those 25 to 44 at 16%, and lower among the 45 pluses. And finally, in relation to podcasts, 9% say they subscribe to some podcast. Higher, the highest group here is among the 25 to 44s at 13%, and only 6% of those age 45 plus subscribe to a podcast. When you when you look across the trend here, and when you ask the question, you know, when you consider the level, the net level of paying to subscriptions, we can see here on the left that 38% say they subscribe to any one of those premium services. And it dropped last year to 36, but rebounded again to 38%. That net figure is being driven by the audio streaming. We can see there was a bit of a drop last year for audio streaming. It was down to 31%, but has rebounded again to 34%, where the subscription levels to podcasting and to YouTube Premium have been pretty stable over the last number of years. So there's more things happening around the audio streaming space there. Right now. Sorry. Just to say though, in relation to the streaming services, while in general the young people are more likely to subscribe than older people, there has been a decline among that youngest group of 15 to 24s. Their paid subscription to their levels of subscription has gone down again this year, and it's perhaps an issue that they're choosing, you know, to subscribe to other things rather than those that audio streaming or podcasting or YouTube Premium. So that's something to watch. We can look specifically at the weekly listening to audio data. And when we analyze that weekly listening data among those who have a paid subscription versus those who don't, we see that a significant majority of regular weekly audio streamers are paid up ad-free subscribers. So if we look at this first chart here, the first bars here on the left, the audio streaming listenings, this is listening in the past week, we can see that 70% of those listeners have a paid subscription to audio streaming. So we assume are listening through that paid subscription. If we can see that for podcast listeners, 27% of people listening to a podcast have a paid subscription to some podcast or other, and 25% are listening of listeners to YouTube Music have a subscription, a premium subscription to YouTube. So quite a high level of use of subscriptions, higher, as I said, among the younger people, some growth among the older ones over the years. But the broad ownership for podcasts and YouTube Premium has been reasonably static over the last few years. The interview then moved on to ask people about their behaviors around the different audio formats. And we can see from that analysis that there's almost universal listening to audio content on the measure of past week. So 96.4% of people are engaged with audio on a weekly basis. And that relates to 4.2 million listeners. So it's a huge engagement across the country with audio content, which is a really positive sign. We specifically then go through the various different formats of audio that we measure, and we can see that radio prevails as the dominant format of audio content consumed. So 88.6% of people listened to live radio in the past week. And this compares to 55.7% who listened to on-demand online audio in the past week. That reflects a small change for radio. Last year, it's down 1% compared to last year, and on-demand online is up 1% compared to last year. So marginal, modest change compared to what we saw this time last year. This particular chart now shows the various formats that we measured. So we can see that 89% of people listened to live radio, 40% said they listened to music streaming in the past week, 31% listened to YouTube music, 22% said they listened to a podcast, whether that was an Irish podcast or an international one. 16% listen to their own music. So own music is defined here as our own personal archives or our own physical music, whether we have them on CDs or vinyl or whatever it might be. So that's what we mean when we talk about own music. And 6% said they listen back to on-demand to Irish radio. And this is the weekly measurement figures. We can see the trend over the years. And we can see that live radio has dropped marginally year on year, while music streaming has increased a little bit. The podcast levels remain reasonably steady. So if we look, the live radio line there is the green line at the top. So as I said, it's relatively modest drop year on year. It's down 1%. So the rate of change is relatively slow. But if we go back further, we can see it's a slow pace, but it is dropping down a little bit. And then for on-demand formats, after the bump that we saw here between 2019 and 2021, so remember this was all around the COVID times, after that bump, the kind of pace of growth has steadied to some degree. We can see there's a little bit of uplift here for music streaming in the past year. So that's plus 2% to the current level of 40%. Listen to YouTube music is plus 1% compared to last year, and it's now at 31%. Listening to podcasts, the purple line there is the same as it was last year. And listening to own music has dropped down back 2 percentage points. And that listening to our own archives, and we've mentioned this before on the webinars previous to this, that's where the biggest change has been the switch from our own music over to on-demand streamings and podcasts and so on. And we could see that big switch happened here back in 2019 as well. So apart from that kind of change that happened in those earlier years, it has been reasonably steady over the time. So in terms of if we look at that trend then among the youngest market, the 15 to 24-year-olds, we can see that listening levels to radio and other digital formats, they've decreased among this age group, not live radio and streaming and podcasting and so on. So of course, reach to on-demand is highest among this cohort, but it has been dropping year on year, as I can say, and you can see the decline somewhere there. So for radio here, we can see that live radio a drop here to 81%. Music streaming is now at 69%. It's down 4 compared to last year. We can see the biggest drop, the biggest declining line, I suppose, there for YouTube, currently now at 45%, and that's a drop of 6%. So there's more happening, I suppose, among those user groups, those younger groups, which kind of makes sense because that's where a lot of the uptake and use of the technologies are happening as well. This is an interesting analysis here that we can see where we did an analysis to try to determine the incremental reach. Obviously, there's a significant level of crossover listening among the digital streaming and radio audiences. We know from the previous chart where we saw that live radio or radio reaches the large majority of the population on that measure of weekly reach. In contrast, less than half, 46% of people are reached via streamers or podcasts if we combine those two together to get a net figure. So radio's at 89%, streaming or podcasts at 46%. So if we add in the music streaming audience and the podcast audiences and so on, we can see a growth from the first bar here shows live radio at 89%. The next bar, if we do a net figure for radio and audio streaming, we increase by 5% to 94%. If we then add in any radio streaming and podcasts, we increase another percentage point to 95%. And if we add in radio streaming, podcasts, YouTube, we increase another point to 96%. So it's a relatively modest incremental growth, but it does reflect the significant level of crossover listening among those digital streaming audiences and radio audiences. And it does reinforce the finding that having radio in the mix is going to deliver maximum reach. You know, when you have a format that reaches 89% of people on its own, it just makes sense, you know, that when you're considering any communications, that's part of the mix. We were able, within the data that we collected, to look at the daily picture of listening. So daily reach, as we would typically know it. So again, the kind of pattern between live radio and the other audio formats is broadly similar, as you can see by the picture here. So we can see that overall radio is the #1 choice by a significant margin. So 77% of people listen to live radio on a daily basis. Music streaming is a significant competitor, particularly when we look over at the younger age groups. I think this kind of shows, when we look on the left here among the 15 pluses, that the radio figures reflect that very regular daily habit among radio audiences. And we've seen before that the audio formats, the smaller audio formats, the streamers and podcasting and so on, they gather reach when the time frame is expanded. So when you talk about weekly reach, it's higher, obviously. When you talk about monthly reach, it's higher again. So it kind of reflects that, you know, people are listening and they're tuning in, but it might not be that they're listening and tuning in every day. When we look on the right-hand side of the screen here and look at the 1524s, we can see on a measure of reach, so listening at all, we can see that 59% of these young people are listening to live radio. So it's still the #1 format, but it's closely followed there by the music streaming at 52%. By YouTube Music at 25%, listening to podcasts at 7%, own music at 7%. So the on-demand formats are a close second on this measure of reach. But as well as, you know, that live radio figure that we see, which is in the leading position, it's the same across all of the age groups. So it's those younger groups and the older groups as well. So this is always an interesting analysis to look at. We can see here, this is kind of a visual representation to try show the position and the amount of time spent on each of the different formats. So we can see that audiences tend to listen to on demand for shorter periods of time. And the opposite is true for radio. So if we look at the first bar here, we can see that live radio has the biggest bar here. And this is the average time spent. It's the relative position among audio format listeners. The chart is aiming to show those relative positions. So each bar is analyzed among audiences of that particular format. So live radio audiences, listen back audiences, music streaming audiences. So irrespective of the number of people who are tuning into these formats, this is easily comparable, because this is showing broadly the amount of time spent. So we can see live radio is almost twice as much time spent as the next nearest format, which is music streaming here. And then it goes, you know, this almost the same for YouTube Music and Own Music, etc. So this, I think, perhaps, you know, this evidence or this analysis that listeners to live radio are tuning in for longer, or listeners to on demand are tuning in for shorter times, I think reflects perhaps the kind of curated or episodic kind of nature of the on-demand podcasts that people are listening to, or the clips that they might listen to. Perhaps are shorter, as I said, more episodic. So hence less time is spent among those audiences. So obviously, you know, the pattern of listening that we see there, it naturally impacts on the share of time spent. So, for example, more listeners who are going to who listen for longer results in higher share of the audio market minutes. And we can see that here by this analysis. We can see here that live radio achieves 73.8% share of audio minutes. We can isolate then, if we go around the bar, we can isolate the time spent among subscribers to a premium audio paid service, for streaming service, for example, versus those who don't pay. And we can see that the share of minutes for music streaming paid is 10.5%, and music streaming free is 3%. We can see that our own music, that share is 2.4%. And listen back to Irish radio is 0.3%. And listening to a podcast, any podcast, is 3.5%. Again, we can split the YouTube Music, those who pay to the premium service and those who don't. So YouTube Music paid has a share of 2.3%, and free has a share of 4.1%. So when we look at the trend over time, while fluctuations across formats and the changes year on year tend to be reasonably small, when we look at a broader trend, we see a drop in share to radio and an increase in streaming and podcasting activities. So currently, for example, live radio has a share of 73.8%. In 2024, in 2022, it was 74.3%. In 2021, it was 78.8%. Music streaming, for example, in 2021 was 10%, and 2025 it is 13.5%. Podcasting was 1.7% and is growing to 3.5%. And the other formats tend to be broadly similar. We're seeing some fluctuations, but they're coming back and settling around the same point: YouTube Music, our own music, and so on. We can then look at the share for the younger market, the 15 to 24s, and we look at their share of audio on an average day relative to the other formats. And we can see among this market, and if you remember, we did see relatively high reach to other audio formats among this group. But we can see that live radio has a share of 46.4% in among the 15 to 24s, and that's almost identical to 2024. Music streaming paid has a share of 22.4%, and music streaming free 10.2%. Own music has a share of 4.7%. Podcasts a share of 3.3%, and YouTube Premium 3.9%, and YouTube Music Free 8.9%. So when you take all of the on-demand stuff together, it has a share together that's higher than live radio. But in the individual formats, live radio is in the leading position there. And over the years that we've measured this, we see a trend whereby time spent by the older listeners, for example, those age 45 plus, to streaming and podcasts, while it's still small, it is increasing, and it kind of increasing incrementally among those older groups. So we showed this slide last year, and this is the idea of what the share might look like if we were just to focus and isolate the time spent on the various formats that take advertising. So in other words, we know that not all audio content is available for advertising. You know, we saw that there's a significant proportion of streaming listening that's happening among those people who have a paid subscription. And of course, when we're listening to our own archives and our own music, that's obviously ad-free as well. So when we exclude those, and when we recalculate the share, removing the time spent on paid for subscriptions to YouTube and to audio streaming, and remove our own archive music, then the share takes on a kind of another dimension again. And we can see that the share to live radio is at 87%. And this is, again, a modest change compared to last year. It was 87.5% last year. We can see now that the music streaming to Spotify or similar is at 3.6%. We can see that podcasts is at 4.2%, and YouTube Music Free is at 4.8%, and Listen Back at 0.4%. So it's a very different picture when we do isolate the formats where advertising can be placed. And we can see a similar pattern again, you know, when we look at the 15 to 24s. We see here that live radio now stands at 67.3%, music streaming at 14.7%, podcasting at 4.9%, and YouTube Music at 12.9%. So we see that the picture changes when we do that recalculation, which is quite interesting to see. We moved on within the interview then to ask, you know, we isolated the people who said they listened to particular formats yesterday, and we asked them a number of questions about where they were and what device they used to listen when they were listening yesterday. So the next chart kind of shows some top line figures there. We can see that 67% of the population said they listened to audio at home, in the home environment. 49% said they listened to audio in the car. 67% used a traditional kind of radio music system to listen, where 32% used a smartphone to listen. So in-car listening is, you know, the home is the main environment for listening to audio content, but in-car listening is the next most used location. So when we look at that by some of the key age groups here, we can see, if we take the first line there, the at-home line, we can see that the home environment is the main location across all of the age groups. 67% overall, 60% among the 15-24s, 62% among the 25-44s, and increasing to 45 to 72%, sorry, among the 45 pluses. We can see with the car listening in the car at 49%, bit lower among the younger ones, the 15-24s, but then higher than average among those 25 to 44s. You know, they're the busy group going to work, and, you know, the kids commute and all that sort of thing. And then on average among the older 45 pluses. We can see when we look at the listening in the work school environment, work school college environment, that it is higher among the younger groups. You know, it's higher than average among 15 to 24-year-olds, 15% of them relative to 12% overall who listen to audio in that environment, and 16% among the 25 to 44-year-olds. And when we ask about, you know, how many are listening to audio when they're out walking or cycling or running, 10% of the 15 plus say they listen in that environment on a daily basis. Again, you can see that increases quite significantly among the younger 15 to 24-year-old group. It's higher than average among the 25-44s, but lower than average then among the 45 pluses. And there's small levels of listening on the bus and the train. 2% of people said they listen there, increasing to 5% among that 15 to 24 year group, and 4% among the 25 to 44 group. So we can see that in-home is the key environment there. And we know from analysis then that live radio does dominate that in-home listening. 53% are tuning into live radio in the home daily. And this is followed by streaming at 16%. So I did say this is a very busy looking chart, but it does show that listening to audio in the car has increased across almost all age groups. So we can see here over the years, 15 to 24s, that's reasonably stable and steady among that group. But we can see the increase among the 25 to 44s. Currently, it's at 56% saying they listen. We can see the increase among the 45 to 64s over time to 55%. And though lower among those aged 65, it has been growing as well to the current position of 34%. So listening in the car has increased across almost all of those age groups. Again, live radio is the go-to format in this environment. You know, 44% of people say they listen daily in the car to live radio. So in terms of the devices people tend to use to listen, the traditional devices do continue to be used in our daily listening habits. We can see that the 67% are using a more traditional music system, kind of radio or music system. But there is significant proportions who use a connected device as well. We can see that 32% say they listen using the smartphone, and that has increased year on year. Driven, I think, by the listening to streaming services. 21% listen daily on a smartphone to streaming services. We can see that 11% now use a smart speaker daily to listen to audio. And we can see that that's been a slow but steady rise in this whole audio space. It's 11% now, it's +1 year on year. But compared to 2021, it was at 6%. So it's slow, but it's a steady increase in terms of using those smart speakers for their audio content. 5% are listening via a PC or a laptop, 3% use a tablet, and 4% using a TV. So we can see, you know, the main devices here is your more standard radio, music system, or whatever that might be, the smartphone and the smart speaker are the bigger devices being used. And when we look at that analysis by the key age groups, again, we can see that the smartphone is the most used device to listen to audio among the younger 15 to 24s. So you can see if we take that line for using a smartphone, we know that 32% of all 15s use the smartphone to listen, and that increases to 55% among the 15 to 24 group who are listening on the smartphone. 44% of the 25 to 44 group are listening on the smartphone. And it drops then among the older groups to 18% among those aged 45 plus. And similarly, using the smart speaker, we can see that there's a slightly higher than average use among those younger groups again, particularly this 25 to 44 age group. It's 13% versus the average of 11. Not a huge difference, but a little bit higher. Whereas the traditional music is highest among, as you might expect, those older groups. But still, a lot of the younger people are using, the 15-24s are using their traditional radio, as are the groups, the 25 to 44s. And we know that among those young people, that 43% are streaming daily using their phones. So we see that 55% of 15 to 24s are listening to audio on their smartphone, and 43% are streaming using their phone. So I'm just going to go over some of those key findings again. That's the last of the slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions after I go through these summary points. So again, we could see against that backdrop of significant competition for attention, obviously in the market now, that audio content reaches the vast majority of the adult population in Ireland, with 96% listening weekly. So it's a massive engagement in this particular sector. We know that audiences have significant digital connections. Smartphone ownership is almost universal at 91%. Ownership of smart speakers at 44%, and Bluetooth wireless at 56%. So this ownership, it does enable easy access to audio content. And we know that there's higher ownership of devices among the younger demographics. When we looked at subscription levels to premium services, they have rebounded this year to the level seen the previous year, and it's currently 38% of adults pay a subscription to one or more service, whether that's streaming or podcast or YouTube Premium. And again, younger people are more likely to pay for audio content, but the levels among those younger people have dropped year on year. And in 2025, there's almost universal engagement in the audio market on a weekly listening basis. We know that radio continues as the dominant form of content consumed, reaching 89% of the adult population weekly. And this compares to 56% listening to online on-demand audio. And while radio is the leading format across all age groups, listening to on-demand is higher among the younger cohorts. We saw then that there's a significant level, and we'd know that intuitively, there's a significant level of crossover listening among digital streaming and radio audiences, with radio achieving the highest reach across all formats. As I mentioned earlier, keeping radio in the mix will deliver maximum reach. So audiences tend to listen to on demand for shorter periods of time. The opposite is true for radio. More people are tuning into radio and staying for longer periods of time. And that will always impact the share figures that we see. And in terms of that share, we see that on average, in terms of the estimated time spent listening, live radio has a share of 73.8%, reflecting a modest drop of 1.7%, whereas music streaming has a share of 13.5%. Podcast share is more or less unchanged since 2024. We saw that at home is the natural environment for listening to audio and remains the most used location across all age groups. Listening in the car, however, has increased to 49% daily, and it does peak among the young to midlife audiences, the 25 to 44s and the 45 to 64 age groups. Live radio is the main format listened to in the car. And listening levels outside of the home in work college environment, 12% are actively listening here on a daily basis, or out walking and running and cycling at 10%. And they're broadly on trend vis-a-vis previous years. Listening in these environments is higher than average among the younger people. And while traditional devices continue to anchor the audio listening habits, almost 1/3 of the population access audio content daily via the smartphone. And in this context, music streaming is the primary driver of this behavior, where 1 in 5 are streaming daily on their smartphone. And smart speakers shows a marginal growth in consumption year on year, reflecting a steady, if relatively slow pace since 2021. And among those who own a device, daily listening via the smart speaker is now at 24%. So they're the key highlights from this particular module, which was conducted during April to June of 2025. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation. I'll just be on screen. So please, people put questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask Karen those questions. And just to say, the presentation will be shared with all attendees afterwards. There'll be some bonus charts in the full deck, because there's extra charts and a few appendices, and they'll be shared. There's also a written report, and we'll share that with you also. There's a written report which gives commentary on the data, so we'll share that with you as well. So Karen, I'm just going to look at some of the questions that have come through. One question here is, do you think listening in car has increased since the return to office since COVID, and has increased due to longer commute times due to traffic?
It's hard to say why it has increased. I mean, our trend definitely shows that there is an increase there. So we can assume, even though we didn't ask those questions, that people are out and about a little bit more, probably more people back at work, it's busier commutes and so on. So we can make a link to that, I assume, but we haven't got a specific question that asks exactly that.
Very good. Another question, just to explain a little bit more around the time of listening, the time spent listening to each format, and how that affects the share of listening.
Okay, so the time spent, the share of listening is also always going to comprise of the estimated time that each of those listeners who say they listen are listening for. So if you have a format that has a high reach, let's take radio, for example, and we saw that radio listeners tend to listen for longer amounts of time. So therefore, there's more people spending more time, so that'll have a bigger impact on the share. So we could see on the chart that showed the relative positions of time spent, we could see that live radio was almost twice as large as the next one, which was music streaming. So when you take the music streaming figure, we know that 40% of that, it's less for daily, it was 20-something% for daily listening to audio streaming. So it's a lower reach, it's less minutes. So when you take those two aspects together, it'll mean that the share is going to be proportionately lower then as well. Because share of time is always is naturally about the time spent. So the formats where people tend to stay and just stay listening for longer will win out on the share. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm just checking, is there any more questions? As I said, the presentation deck, full presentation deck with some appendices and the full written report will be available to you shortly this afternoon. So that will be sent on. It'll be also available on the website. I think that's it in terms of questions, Karen. I mean, I think the data was quite clear in terms of how it's presented. So many thanks, everyone, for attending. There will be next webinar will be in January 26th, where we'll be looking at research that explains how effective music is when it's integrated into advertising. So look forward to that webinar in January. I just think there is one more question. No, it's just a thank you, actually. Thank you from somebody. And there's also a question, is the webinar recorded? Yes, it is, and it will be on the website later on this afternoon. So many thanks, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for attending. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.